let's get started to talk about praise.
Mhm.
I thought maybe we should say something first about how our research turned to the topic of praise in the first place, because of course it's not something that either of us have necessarily worked on a great deal before.
Mhm.
So why don't you start by saying something about what made your research turn to the topic of praise?
Yeah, thanks, Hallvard. I think my interest in praise came from sort of two directions. So one aspect of it was that I'd been working for a bit on blameworthiness and moral responsibility. Um, and in that literature, some of the authors had connected moral responsibility and blameworthiness quite closely, such that what it is to be morally responsible is to be blameworthy. And I wanted to find ways of thinking about moral responsibility that made a bit more space for responsibility in relation to other kinds of attitudes, both negative like disappointment, but also positive ones like moral encouragement or moral praise. But when I was looking at what was said in relation to praise, I found that there wasn't a huge amount of contemporary literature on that. That discussion would be of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, or praise and blame, but then it would move on to talk just exclusively about blame and blameworthiness rather than praise. And I think that's because, as Marianne mentioned in the introduction, sometimes there is an assumption that praise is benefit, and other times perhaps the assumption that praise is just sort of symmetrical with blame. So once you've said things about blame, you don't really need to sort of elaborate too much the account of praise. So that was one direction that I came at it from. And then the other was that I was also sort of working in social philosophy and engaging with work in feminist philosophy and philosophy of race. And there was some really great literature there about the ways in which attributions of virtue and vice are shaped by oppressive norms and expectations. And there was a great book by Mitch Trevia. They were looking at the ways in which attributions of blame might be shaped by oppression. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be surprising if praise was insulated from those kinds of social forces? So those were the two sort of theoretical directions from which I approached the topic of praise. And then, of course, like my actual working on it was encouraged and stimulated by, there was a workshop on social dimensions of responsibility organised by Katrina Mackenzie and Katrina Hutchinson, and then another workshop on praise organised by Emily Bingeman, and that really sort of galvanised my thinking about the topic by engaging with other people working on interesting related ideas. How about you, Hallvard? Is that the same? Yeah, what was your trajectory into praise? I imagine it was.
Well, I came at it sort of slightly by accident, really. I was working on the problem of moral luck, which is the problem that, on the one hand, there is a strong intuition or conviction that when you hold someone morally responsible for something, what you hold them responsible for is within their control. And then there's also looks like to be like it's a fact of human life that very often moral assessments do seem to transcend that people get blamed and praised for things that, in strictly speaking, is not within their control. And so it presents a kind of a tension within our moral practices. And like most people working on the problem of moral luck, I was initially working on the concept of blame, the negative side. And I did that for a while, and I kind of got a little bit stuck. I felt I was going around in circles. And so I thought, okay, why don't we just try and switch it and look at praise instead? And it quickly turned out that in some respects, when I spoke to people about praise, many people, I'm not saying everyone, but many people found it easier to think that praise was, if you might call it, luck friendly, that people were a little bit less worried about the fact that people were praised for things that were beyond their control. And if praise and blame are both central or equally central to morality, that tells us something important about how we think about moral luck and the problem of whether there is such a thing as a moral luck. And so I started looking at the literature on praise and found, as you said earlier, that there wasn't that much of it. I was looking at sort of standard books about moral responsibility or moral theory, and I looked in the index and it said praise, see blame. And then you go and read about blame. And so the assumption is either perhaps people aren't very interested in praise, or perhaps it's assumed that praise is just the flip side of blame. So once you've said everything about blame, then you can kind of say the same thing about praise, just it's the dual of it. But if it's true that praise is more like friendly than blame, then it looks like that isn't true. And so I became curious. And so I started digging around, both in contemporary literature, but also in some of the historical literature, to find out what philosophers had said about this. And I found it's so interesting that it became my main preoccupation, at least for part of my time. So that's how I got into it, really.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you find that in the historical figures that you've looked at, there's continuity between the ways in which praise is being discussed there and the contemporary debates, or that there's quite different framings of praise in that literature?
That's quite interesting. I think insofar as and we'll go on to talk about this, insofar as we're talking about problematic aspects of praise, I think a lot of the literature in the sort of the modern period and the more recent period has tended to speak about the senses in which we should be suspicious about forms of praise. So in that sense, there is some continuity. Mm-hmm. But I think that going much further back to the ancient world, which I'm not an expert on, there's a sense in which there was a much wider and much more lively debate in what perhaps you might call the philosophy of rhetoric, where philosophers are making contributions to how people should speak in public and giving people advice and instructions about how to do praise well. Okay. And I think that's probably less of a prominent feature in recent and contemporary philosophy. Yeah. Although I do suspect that some of the work in social philosophy that you may have referred to earlier is not a million miles away from that project, because a lot of the social philosophy we have seen develop over the last few decades has taken its inspiration from the philosophy of speech acts. Mm-hmm. And so speech acts, of course, are ways of speech and public speech. And so there's a sense in which there is a theme there that is shared, but it's not so much about nowadays about people standing in the Senate and speaking to the emperor. It's more about local and varied forms of or in which praise either is used or misused. So not continuity in terms of the context, but I think some continuity in terms of, maybe we should say that, the philosophy of rhetoric is coming back in perhaps under a different label, the philosophy of praise.
Can I ask a question about that idea of how to do praise well in that context? Because I think that to the extent that does appear in some of the philosophical literature now, it's attuned to the idea of how to avoid harmful praise, or how to avoid hypocritical praise or patronizing praise. Is that the sense that was at issue with how to praise well in the context of the ancients, or was it more to do with sort of instrumental goals, like how to praise well so you can get what you want from it, like how to praise the emperor well so that you get favor, which is a much more kind of instrumentalist framing, perhaps.
Yes. So again, I'm not a great expert on the ancients, but my sense from reading what I have read about it, I think we're talking about public contexts in which praise forms a part of something you might think of in the sense of like a ritual. And the ritual has various types of functions, because there's a target for the praise, which may or may not be present. It may be someone who's alive, or it may be someone who's dead. And then there's an audience for the praise, namely the people who are around at the time. And the praise has to kind of be fitting, so that there is an instrumental element to it. It's not so much necessarily that the person giving the praise is seeking some personal benefit from it, but there's certainly a social benefit. It plays a social role, in the sense that, of course, we today do things like, we say eulogies of people, and we congratulate people in birthdays and celebrations of that type. And it's in that context, I think, it's in that context we should think of the instrumental aspect of the praise that they were interested in, or the people I've read have been interested in.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds really interesting to me, because I'm quite interested in that sort of the role that praise might play in relation to those audiences. So lots of the contemporary literature is focused on sort of second personal communication between the sort of deliverer of the praise and the recipient of the praise. And I think that's really interesting, and there's lots to be got from looking at that kind of communication. But I think that does miss out the sort of wider audiences to the praise, and the role that expressions of praise can play in relation to that wider audience as well. So that's really interesting that's kind of really salient in the literature that you've been looking at as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. And if you think about this literature that's recently developed in moral and political philosophy of having a standing to make a certain contribution, I think there might be interesting comparisons and contrasts about having a standing to praise someone who is there and having a standing to praise someone who's not there. It's relevant there.
Yes, yeah. So is that because you think that the matter of standing is a sort of interpersonal matter? It's your relationship to the recipient of the praise or to the audience of the praise that might be salient to whether you have standing?
There are certain things perhaps that it's appropriate for me to say directly to someone that it might not be appropriate to say when they're not there, and perhaps even vice versa.
Yeah.
So just going back to your own work, if you wanted to say why praise has become an important topic for you philosophically, what is there one thing that you think it kind of that makes it stand out as worth studying, or is it just that it's a part of a wider project which needs to be dealt with among other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of very interesting questions that arise in relation to praise. The one sort of thing that really got me interested and excited in thinking about praise was trying to sort of understand and articulate connections between practices of praising and social oppression, I guess. So the case, I mean, I first got interested in thinking about the idea or the assumption that praise is a benefit, that you can't really harm the recipients of praise. And that just struck me as problematic. And then when I went looking for cases, I just found when you start looking for a phenomenon, you see it everywhere. And I found lots of really interesting examples in bits of literature and philosophical writings. And then also in discussing these things, people often have really nice, rich examples of it as well. But there were some really sort of rich and paradigmatic examples of expressions of praise that struck me as connected in interesting ways to think about praise in relation to oppression. Shall I animate, by giving you some of these examples now?
Well, I guess this brings us very nicely on to the topic of your forthcoming book, Oppressive Praise. So why don't you say something riffing on this about what your book is about?
Yes, I mean, it's exactly about that phenomenon. So it sort of tries to articulate the relationship between praise and social oppression, thinking about cases where it looks like oppressive norms or expectations are informing the expression of praise, but then those expressions themselves sort of entrench and have downstream implications for social oppression as well. And I think there's some examples that really vividly animate thinking about this. So one of the key examples in the book is an example written about by Serene Cader and Matthew Lindauer of fathers getting praise for basic parenting when mothers don't. And I think those kinds of that kind of example sort of raises a worry about the distribution of praise, which I think itself is a really interesting question. But I also think there are other examples that don't have that kind of distributive or comparative dimension to them. So I also try to scrutinize what's going on in the kind of cases talked about by Stella Young, the disability rights activist, who raises concerns about disabled people being praised for being inspirational. We see these kind of patterns of oppressive norms informing expectations and informing expressions of praise, where fat people are praised for their courage and just sort of wearing whatever they want to wear. And then Daryl Dwing-Sue has some interesting examples in his work on microaggressions of Black people in academic spaces being praised for being articulate, being so articulate. And I think in all of these cases, there's this sort of even if the praise is intended to be sincere, not insulting, actually giving credit, it's still informed, I think, by either stereotypes or low expectations that are, shaped by oppressive norms. And I think the praise ends up conveying those norms and values, even if the person expressing the praise doesn't intend to do that. So I think thinking about those kinds of cases is really helpful in trying to identify ways in which praise can go wrong, even when people are trying to use it in a positive way. I think we're all familiar with the phenomenon of backhanded compliments, right, where people are expressing praise but don't really mean it. But I think in these sorts of cases there can be, sincere and genuine expressions of praise, but in ways that are informed by these sort of stereotype-shaped expectations. And so then in the book I try and tease out sort of some of the implications of that, some of the causal impacts of that. It can perpetuate patterns of marginalization or devaluation of some people's labor or achievements, entrenchment of problematic norms, and sometimes also the sort of connection to the distribution of material resources. Like sometimes these instances of praise and patterns of evaluation are connected up with material resources like bonuses or promotions, and so on. So there's a bit of that kind of diagnostic work of what's going wrong in these cases, but then I also try and sort of tease out what that can show us about what praise is and does, and a bit more harking back to that question that you raised before about how we can do praise well. So how we could avoid expressing praise in these ways and norms for doing that, and thinking about how we might accept or reject praise, and more or less effective ways of doing that, especially rejecting praise, as in these cases the recipients of the praise often want to reject it.
So am I right to think that there are at least two strands of the praise that's problematic in your project? There's one type which is like an unwanted gift. It's given by good intention, but it's inappropriate. And then there's another theme which is like, I don't know, like a poisoned gift. It's the person who is insincere or manipulative in their praise. Are those the two kind of themes, or do they under-describe the strands that you're interested in?
I think they might under-describe it a bit. I like that. I like those analogies, but I think the idea of an unwanted gift could partially capture some of what's going on, because in some of these cases people might sort of not want the praise, but I think even if somebody was not rejecting the praise or didn't feel troubled by it, it might still be problematic, because it would be sort of entrenching norms for the wider moral community, and other audiences might pick up on the sort of stereotypes or sort of deflated expectations that people have. So in a way, I think maybe there's a third category of sort of people giving a poisoned gift without realizing that it's poisoned, and so the recipient may or may not know about that, and may or may not want the gift, but the deliverer of it may not know it's poisoned either, but it still could be a damaging and sort of morally worrying gift. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm sort of shoehorning too much into your analog there.
No, because now we're dealing with a scenario where the praise may be sincerely offered, and it may be received with gratitude, but it's actually embodied in a structure of social life which is in some sense wrong. And so it could be, from a first personal point of view of everyone involved, it might seem that everything is going well, but it's not actually going well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as it happens in the cases that I discussed, the recipients of the praise have rejected it, and that's what's kind of led them to write vividly about the kinds of norms that they take to be underpinning the praise. But I think that that's sort of something that's born of often their sort of perspective as thinkers and activists in those spaces, and there's probably lots of other examples of praise being delivered in alignment with those norms where it might be welcomed, but I don't think that makes it unproblematic from the point of view of its connection to oppression.
And in the context of your project and working through these examples, have you found any, or come to any surprising or challenging conclusions? Anything you sort of didn't expect or has particularly troubled you
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I think there are a number of unresolved issues in my mind, but one in particular that I really feel that I've come to different views on at different times is to do with the distribution of praise. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts about this as well. But when I first started thinking about these cases, I thought, yeah, part of what's really problematic here is there's this unfair distribution of recognition and esteem, like fathers but not mothers getting praise, or white people but not black people getting praise. Like that, there's this sort of unfair distribution. But as I then sort of tried to unravel and untangle some of the arguments about the norms governing praise, I started to think that doesn't really get at the heart of what's going on in these cases. I think the sort of underpinning core is the expectations in relation to which praise is given. But also I just feel like I'm not now signed up to the idea that that a norm of fair distribution applies to praise, because I think part of what's significant in our practices of praising is that we sort of choose what to praise and whom to praise, and that's what makes it really meaningful to us. And it's not the kind of thing that can be sort of divvied up according to some distributive norm. But that, of course, then means that I've got to do a bit of explaining away of those intuitions that there is something going wrong in the cases where one group and not another are getting praised. So yeah, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. Have you encountered thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's I've thought about the idea of praise as a distributive good, and I guess there are ways in which we can see social advantages to having a wide distribution of praise. I've spoken in my own work to people who work in education with children about this and how they manage praise in the classroom. And it seems that at least the teachers I've spoken to many of them are very acutely aware of the fact that if there's too much of an asymmetrical distribution of praise in the classroom, that can have negative effects both on the people who are praised and the ones who are not praised. So I think that's a consideration. Now, you said that one of the things that have made you skeptical about the idea of perhaps praise as a distributive good is that we choose who to praise, and it's so we have some agency in making judgments about who deserves it. I think that brings us back to the question of moral responsibility, where we started our conversation, because there's a sense in which the distributive features of praise in the classroom, those facts somehow abstract away from what's in the control of any particular individual who is or is not praised. So I think that having some sense of tension there, I think, is a perfectly natural thing.
Do you think that tension is also to do with the sort of, yes, this is another issue that I sort of feel like I'm still grappling with, the relationship between the kind of backward-looking desert-based and forward-looking kind of instrumentalist bits of praise as well, that there's a matter of who deserves praise, but then it also does have this sort of more forward-looking function in sort of encouraging and I think also in entrenching norms, and I guess both of those things are sort of writ large in a classroom, where you both want to give credit to students who are doing well, but also encourage those who need it, and also set norms. So I guess the sort of pull of the competing norms that might govern praise perhaps is part of what's creating those tensions there. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of disappointingly pluralistic about this. I think it's helpful to think about different dimensions of praise, even if we have an underlying theoretical framework that reduces it maybe to one or two factors. You could be a very sophisticated consequentialist about the whole thing, perhaps, or some kind of non-consequentialist with deontological constraints or whatever. But before you get to that kind of very abstract level, I think, yes, there is this backward-looking, what you might call a retributive aspect of it, which based on desert, there's definitely an instrumental aspect of it, getting certain social effects. But I think I would also isolate an expressive aspect. I think that was present in some of the things you say, that when you praise someone, you're saying something about yourself and your relationship to them. It can be a form of welcome. It can be a form of inclusion that you're engaged in. And I think just too quickly reducing the expressive aspect of that communication to something else, I think is not very illuminating. And then there is, I think, sometimes just almost boringly performative aspect of praise. You're praising someone for what is that they have actually achieved, and they did very well in their examination or in their performance or whatever it might be. So I think I'm happy to work with these sort of 4 dimensions without necessarily reducing them to something simpler. I wonder whether, do you have a sort of a clear philosophical theoretical framework that you'd like to fit it into, or are you not quite there yet?
I mean, I'm not disappointed by your pluralism, Hallvard. I'm keen on pluralism too. Yeah, I think those 4 dimensions are really interesting. I mean, I guess I'd thought both of the sort of backward looking and forward looking aspects, and I guess in terms of the sort of forward looking instrumentalist side to it, I think there's multiple things that might be going on with respect to that. So not just sort of crudely rewarding for good behavior, but just encouraging by celebrating somebody's doing something, and also more indirect forms of instrumentalism, like just showing that you think these values are worth celebrating and you want them to be ones that are in our moral community. I think that's part of what's going wrong with oppressive praise, is that the values that are being celebrated are ones that we maybe don't want to be shaping our moral community. I mean, I also think that maybe there's this is again a perhaps somewhat unresolved issue for me, in that I don't know if it's a norm that's sort of internal to or external to our responsibility practices, but just a norm of, and this is drawing on Mitch Trevier's work about oppression and blame, that you might just think a norm of challenging oppression, that should sort of constrain our expressions of praise. And that could be, something that's really important in thinking about the distribution of praise in a classroom, I guess, as well, that whatever you want to reward or encourage, got to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that sort of marginalizes some learners or entrenches stereotypes of others. Yeah. I know that you're also writing a book on praise, Hallvard. Is this kind of framework with these 4 dimensions this something that you use to structure your book?
I certainly use it to structure my thinking. I'm not sure if I'll use it to structure the larger work, but it'll certainly be present. I don't feel a great pressure to adopt a more reductive, simpler theoretical framework at this time. I think what I'm currently grappling with is the question whether we should think of praise as something that we leave behind as we improve, or whether a culture of praise is consistent with the situation where things are going well. Because there's certainly a tendency in much of the philosophical literature not only to focus about problematic aspects of praise, but also on the idea that once people become mature or excellent or virtuous, praise is no longer, at least in the same sense, appropriate. And that's a thought that puzzles me. And so I've been thinking a little bit about to what extent praise is consistent with the situation where we're actually doing well, as a way of celebrating each other. And it's interesting why there has been relatively little attention paid to that by many of our colleagues. Maybe because we're such a critical profession that we specialize in putting each other down. We don't have that kind of instinct to hold each other up. But of course, there is one function praise might have instrumentally, is of course to remind ourselves when we are doing well that we are actually doing well. So I think there's some space for praise in an environment that is not so hostile to virtue and justice.
Yeah, so in relation to that, I really like, and in the spirit of lifting each other up rather than criticizing, I really like Tessa Calhoun's work on praise and appreciation, which I think fits quite nicely with your thought about, virtuous people, maybe even if we're sort of fully excellent and fully virtuous in such a community, there might still be a role for praise that we might appreciation might still be really important there. Celebration of each other might still be really important in that context.
Yeah, that's a good thing to mention. Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Mm.
So moving on to another question, which is the future.
Mhm.
What, if anything, do you see yourself thinking about in terms of praise in the future, and why?
Yeah. So this relates there's two things in particular that I'm thinking about now and going forward. And one of them relates to this question about the distributive norms of praise. And it's to do with using things to praise. So lots of the literature about praise is to do with verbal expressions of praise. But of course, we do often express praise through things as well. Trophies or cash prizes or statues. And there's been a bit of literature on statues, but some of them at least praise, but not all perhaps. And I actually think that the conclusions we might draw about the distribution of praise might be quite different when we look at using things to praise. So I then want to kind of circle back and think about whether that shapes and changes my thinking about the distribution of praise in the non-material cases as well. So that's something I've been thinking about a bit with Sam Liao. We've been thinking about using things to praise and how that raises interesting questions about fit and the sort of meaning of the objects that are used to express praise. So that's one direction. And then we started talking a bit earlier on about the idea of standing, and I'm interested in thinking about standing not just to give praise, but also to receive praise, and also receive or accepting or rejecting praise, but also vicariously. So sometimes people accept or reject praise on somebody else's behalf, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon, because sometimes it seems appropriate for people to do that, and other cases it seems absolutely inappropriate for them to do that. So I'm interested to think a bit more about what we can learn from about standing by thinking about those sorts of cases. So yeah, that's where I might go next. How about you, Hallvard? What are you going to think about in future?
Well, I guess the first thing is something I've already said something about, which is the compatibility with praise and excellence and praise and virtue when things are going well. I'd like to think more about that. The other thing I'd like to think more about is something about being a praiser and the psychology of being a praiser and the lack of self-consciousness in it that I have felt personally. I mean, I was rather surprised when I started thinking about the philosophy of praise that I had myself a much cruder understanding of myself as a praiser and the praisee than I had expected as a philosopher. And I'm interested in thinking more about why that would be, whether there is something about us as sort of as moral, something about moral sensibility that is kind of less attuned to it in some way. And that's something I'd like to find out more about in one way or another.
That sounds super interesting.
Yeah.
I look forward to continuing these conversations, but I think we're supposed to wrap up now, aren't we?
We should wrap up.
Okay, it's been great to discuss these things. I look forward to continuing the conversations and also to hearing other folks' questions too.
Thank you both, Jules and Hallvard. It was a great conversation, and it provoked many questions from the audience. So I will ask some of those questions in our time. Paul asks, you mentioned standing to praise or blame. Do you think this is one area where there is asymmetry, and if so, in what way? Jules probably start, and then Hallvard.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's probably an asymmetry in what we say about standing. So I think there's probably symmetry with respect to there being standing conditions, both for expressing praise and for expressing blame. But I think the story that we'd end up telling about why that's important in the case of blame and in the case of praise might differ. So one reason for that, I think, is that perhaps due to the nature of blame being a sort of harsh and retributive thing, we might sort of worry about people doing that in sort of hypocritical ways, being particularly motivated to avoid blame themselves, in a way that I think, you know, those kinds of worries might not arise in relation to praise. So I think, yeah, I think the story about what standing involves for praise is probably going to differ with respect to the story about what standing involves for blame. I mean, I actually don't have a fully worked out view on this. I've been thinking about it today and thinking about standing conditions for praise, and some of them get unpacked in terms of the praiser should share the evaluative commitments that they're celebrating. So they should sort of be properly committed to the values that they're celebrating. And some authors think that praise is sort of morally objectionable if that lack of commitment is there. And I guess I'm not wholly convinced that that's the case, partly because I'm, you know, as I was mentioned earlier, I'm a pluralist, and I think there's lots of valuable things in the world, and we can't be fully committed to all of them. And it seems like it would still be okay to praise somebody for doing things in accordance with some values that you think are great values, even if they're not the ones that you yourself have fully signed up to. So yeah, that's an incomplete answer. What do you think, Hallvard?
Yeah, my thoughts are still developing on this, but I can try out a certain kind of argument. It's based on what some philosophers have said about why we should be suspicious about praise, which is that the person who praises claims a certain standing in terms of being able to achieve certain things or understand certain things, so that they are in a position to give someone a compliment. And so, for example, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche thought that the praiser is somebody he's like, or she's like a thief. They see some virtue out there, and then they kind of appropriate it to themselves by claiming that they have the same kind of standing in terms of achievement as the person that they're praising. So there's a suspicion towards that. It's like it's a social climbing exercise. Now, one thing you might think is that in order to be in a position to praise someone, you have to be able to understand or perhaps have achieved a certain type of virtue in order to see what it is to get something right. And you might think, and some people do think, that that's less true in the case when someone has done something wrong, that it takes less of us to be able to see that something is the matter. And if that's true, then you may not require the same kind of standing to blame someone, because if someone has wronged you, you may not be able to understand exactly why, or you may not be in the position of power or understanding with the person who has hurt you, but you might nevertheless have perfect standing to say no to that. So that's one argument. I'm not entirely sure if that's never going to apply to praise, but it is certainly something that some people have said about it.
Great, thank you. So Kit asks, they are curious about hierarchies of praise, particularly in the workplace, praise from various levels of management or lack thereof. I think it suits also the classroom praise example.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question as well. And in fact, this is if I had to kind of mention a third area of future investigation, it would be to do with institutional praise, because I think there are certain ways in which, yeah, practices of praise can get distorted when they get imported into institutions, and what can be, I mean, not necessarily, but I think often that does happen. Yes, and the way that praise might be used as a sort of incentive could, you know, to promote certain values or certain kinds of behaviors in institutional contexts, I think is something that's worth yeah, scrutiny and thinking more about. I think there might be differences between the way that praise gets used in institutional contexts and ways in which we find it in interpersonal contexts, where, as we've said, you know, interpersonally, praise can be a way of celebrating each other or sort of expressing appreciation for each other. It can also be a way of manipulating or trying to control. But I think those positive aspects of it are less likely to be rendered visible when praise gets used in institutional contexts. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Hallvard?
Well, I guess in institutions, the ethics of praise will often be a part of the ethics of professional roles. And so you might think there are norms within certain kinds of roles of what kind of a praise is appropriate to give for someone within that role. And praise may go wrong if someone acts outside of that role in a way that is inexcusable, or might misuse their role, giving praise in a certain kind of way, where it's not appropriate or not wished for. Patronizing praise can work like that, I guess. And with respect to social hierarchies, I think this is one of those areas where suspicions about praise, even for someone who is a praise fan like myself, suspicions about praise definitely are worth taking account of, given the fact that we all know about the effects of various forms of flattery and sycophancy, various ways of gaining social advantage by saying nice things about people because you want certain things, even though they are not really subject to the kind of performance that should be measured in that scenario, in that context. Hence, again, the importance of professional roles and the norms that govern them.
Can I just add to that some of the cases that first got me really interested in praise was looking at some studies from empirical social psychology that were sort of looking at patterns of praise there were vignettes, but they were describing people in the workplace and patterns of praise as they were distributed to men in the workplace who displayed altruistic behavior and women in the workplace who displayed altruistic behavior. And participants in these studies showed a pattern of praise whereby women's altruism didn't go recognized and didn't get praised, but men's altruism did. And there were then consequences for sort of recommendations for promotion and reward. So I think that's an instance of praise in an institutional context where there's sort of significant outcomes with respect to material resources but also just the distribution of esteem within that workplace. And the praisers weren't trying to do this, but they just had these sort of stereotype informed patterns of evaluation. So yeah, those contexts in which praise gets used institutionally, I think, are really interesting ones to think about some of the problems of praise, as well as the ways in which we could do it better in those contexts.
Thanks. Angie Hobbs, who said hello to Hallvard and Jules in the chat previously, would like to you say something about moral, psychological, and educational effects of praising on the person or group who giving the praise.
From the perspective of the person giving the praise.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to speak now from my experience of speaking to a small number of people who work in education about their experience with praise. And they say various different things, but one of the things they have said is that praise is a way of staying in control of the situation in an educational context, particularly in a rowdy and complex classroom. So perhaps their self-conception of how they operated as praisers were, to a large extent, when they spoke about this, instrumental. But no doubt that's not the only role that praise plays for them. Some educational contexts seem to have developed certain types of protocols for praise and communication of performance, so that the teachers have to both give expression to the performance of their pupils, but also to some other element of it, which may include such things as effort or attempts to improve, and so as to develop more than one aspect in which people can be given positive or negative feedback. So those are two things I can think of from the point of view of the educator that I have spoken to about the role on how to think about praise from the point of view of the educator. Jules, what do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know of bits of literature about the sort of potential effects on the recipients of praise, but I don't know much about the sort of psychological effects of giving praise. I mean, I should imagine that much would hang on, yeah, partly the framework that one has been given in which to deliver praise, but also I think the more that one becomes aware of the potential problems of praise, like, you know, that if you were an educator who was aware of the studies on praise that that show that you know, it can actually sort of undermine the esteem of the, rather than elevating the esteem of the people who you're giving it to, or perpetuate certain stereotypes, or be experienced as sort of controlling and manipulating. I imagine that if you were aware of those findings, giving praise is actually a bit of, could be quite an anxiety producing experience. Like, so I think there's an inclination to think, oh, delivering praise is sort of always nice, and it creates friendly and warm interpersonal interactions. But I would expect that if you're aware of some of the risks of delivering praise, it can make it a more anxiety producing interaction. But it would be really interesting to know if there's more evidence about, yeah, the effects on the people delivering the praise rather than on the recipients of it, because I'm not aware of lots of literature on that. So yeah, if anyone's got recommendations, it'd be good to hear them.
Yeah, I've just been reflecting a bit on this after starting to talk about it and think about it and listening to what you said, and just trying to think about it from a first personal perspective. I think one of the dangerous things about praise from a perspective of an educator, which of course we are, is that it can be, there might be a temptation to use it as a way of making things be easier than perhaps they need to be, or perhaps sometimes that they should be. It can be a way of sort of softening things, because time passes more nicely if you just say nice things. And that might be something that one does without really being aware of it, because it reduces tension. You don't want too much negativity, because negativity intuitively has the association with harm and wrong. And so there may be a tendency to be too nice, but I think now I'm on a slippery slope and I'm going to stop.
I think that this reminds me though of a sort of norm and habit that I've seen instantiated, I think, to good effect in philosophical contexts, where because we're all philosophers who like, as you said before, we like criticizing, we like, you know, picking apart arguments, that there's, in some contexts of reading groups that I go to, there's a kind of norm instated that we should say what we like about the paper before we hone in on the bits that we don't like it. And I think that can be a really valuable thing. We're often too quick to go to negative and critical remarks, and I think it's good to sort of also remind ourselves of the value of appreciation. So perhaps that's a danger for philosophers more than for others.
Yeah, that is kind of related to Naomi's question. Have you thought about parental praise of children as sometimes communicating conditionality of love? For example, you matter to me because you are X, or you are doing Y, or you are good at something.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting research by a social psychologist, Eddie Brummelman, on this phenomenon precisely, that that some ways of praising children can be really damaging to their self-esteem. And I think part of it is that sort of conditionality, but I think sometimes some of the research shows that it's to do with just setting really high expectations that children then feel like they constantly have to be meeting in order to have approval. So yeah, I think that literature is really interesting. And yeah, so this connects up with my feelings about sort of anxiety and praise, because as a parent, I find myself praising lots as a parent. You know, it's much nicer to deliver praise than it is to be telling that. Often lots of the parental guidance that you get is, you know, praise, you know, try and avoid negative interactions. But yeah, thinking about praise, I think that is overly simplistic, because praise can itself be a form of negative interaction. Yeah, I think that seems like a context where it's really important to get, not just to praise, but to get praise right, and to be using it in an actually constructive way that doesn't damage children.
So if I understand this correctly, the research from Brummelman is about the effect that praise has on the child, because it becomes in some sense addicted to it, or it feels bad when it's not there. So it's not so much that the praise itself is causing harm, but simply that it's used in a dynamic context. It's like a reward mechanism that becomes it develops a dependency. And so I guess the thought, if that's the case, then the thought would be that it loses its value, because it becomes the content of the praise is no longer the point. The point is control and reward for the reason that you just need it all the time. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think there is also something to do with the sort of excessively high setting of expectations that children feel that they just can never measure up. So even if then so maybe part of the effect is to do with sort of feeling the constant need for praise and lacking esteem in the absence of it. But I think some of the studies were suggesting that it was also to do with sort of just feeling like they were never good enough. There was just these really high expectations of them set as well. Yeah, I mean, this connects up as well a bit with some work that I did before I really even thought of myself as working on praise, about praise as a reward, and the way that praise sometimes gets modeled as a reward. And that seemed really unsatisfactory to me, the idea that that it's just this kind of carrot. And I think those kinds of studies connect up with that idea that you can't think of praise as just this sort of thing that is a reward, or that sort of is used as an incentive, that actually there's sort of more attention needed to the context of the relationship in which it's communicated, and how it can be expressed in a way that is affirming and encouraging, and not just sort of controlling or setting high expectations, or telling people that you only care about them when they achieve. Yeah.
Yeah, we are almost run out of time, but I'm combining two questions. One from Joanna, Johanna, I'm sorry. She asks that what happened that in the modern era we don't praise heroic acts, but on the other hand, Robert connects the praise to the Remembrance Day, which was today, 11th November, and it's sort of encouraging, in his opinion, nationalism and militarism and all sorts of things. And the question is, what is the relationship between honoring people and praising them?
Yeah, that's a really good question about the connection between honoring and praising, because I think they seem like distinct but overlapping phenomenon, so that you could honor somebody without praising them, and you can praise someone without honoring them. But I'd want to think a bit more about exactly how to delineate the two. But I think it's that example of the potential for praise or honor to end up sort of celebrating values that perhaps are not values that we'd want to celebrate and honor, is a really good one. Yeah, I guess that's an example. So in contrast to the first part of that question, that's an example where there is a kind of public practice of praising and honoring. And I think there are others as well. So I find this interesting and sort of heartwarming in a way. Often local newspapers are really good sources of narrative about heroic behavior, sort of everyday heroism. People diving onto train tracks to save a stranger, or going out of their way in putting themselves in danger to rescue a toddler, you know, things like that that I think I don't know, are they sort of the modern analog to the elegies that Johanna wrote about? But whenever I want to find sort of narratives about praise, I often find that's a really useful place to look, because local newspapers have lots of stories of everyday heroism, I think.
So I think it's hard to give a very precise answer to the praise versus honoring question, because I'm not sure if we have an understanding of either of those as a kind of natural kind. There are various ways of understanding those things, but in relationship to the example that came up in the question, I suppose that sometimes we are at least being asked to honor people without necessarily praising them, because we're asked to show a certain kind of respect. And I think sometimes people think that there are certain things we should respect, not necessarily in the manner of praising someone's actions or their achievement, but simply because we stand in a certain relation to them. I think that's one way of thinking about how they might be different. But I think there are other forms of honoring that probably would be forms of praise. But I think when people are asked to honor things in the past, that's partly a question of a certain type of respect that in some sense, I think, detaches from acts of praise. Although when we talk about Remembrance Day, of course, in some cases, it's intended to be praising what some people did.